Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Mr. James Brew. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. James is a senior international advisor working with the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs flagship program in Cambodia called the Cambodia-Australian Partnership for Resilient Economic Development, or CAPRED. James is also a recognized global expert in the field of public-private dialogue, and we'll talk about PPD today. So, James, before we talk of public-private dialogue, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what got you interested in the area of economic development consulting.
Well, firstly, look, thanks very much for having me. What a real privilege it is. So I started out in economic development by the private sector. Mm-hmm. So I worked in the logistics and engineering sectors for quite a while, but my side interests were politics and history. So an opportunity came up with the World Bank Group, the International Finance Corporation in Cambodia in the early 2000s, that really combined these two interests together.
Very interesting. So let's now talk about public-private dialogue, an area that you have a lot of experience in. Could you, for our listeners, explain the concept of public-private dialogue?
So the concept is to bring the government and private sector together to focus on binding constraints and work through a process to overcome those constraints, ultimately to deliver change to an economy.
And James, could you give us an example of how this would work, or some project that you have worked on, if it's not confidential?
Yeah, well, I've had the privilege of working on many of these public-private dialogues around the world. One of my favorite, I guess, is one that I've learned a lot from, and which I think has shown some leadership, is the Government Private Sector Forum in Cambodia. It emerged out of the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, which also coincided with conflict and emerging Cambodia coming out of the long period of conflict. So the fact that it's been able to be sustainable for a long period of time really is a fascinating example for other countries in similar situations.
And when you talk public-private dialogue, are there one or multiple countries involved?
Well, it really, we're looking at country by country, but you can look at it in a regional context as well. From an emerging market perspective, especially in fragile and conflict-affected states, we really look to get into a single country and build the economy through the relationship of the government and private sector. But you can look at it as regional dialogues happen, but they need less in terms of development support than an emerging market.
And how, in your view, has public-private dialogue evolved over the years?
It's a long concept, PPD. It goes back millennia, really. We look at the guilds, for example, in Italy and Europe, and all countries with major trading powers over history have had this relationship between the government and private sector. In recent years, however, over the last 15, 20 years, there was a real resurgence in the interest in economic growth in emerging markets as a pillar, and public-private dialogue was viewed as a tool for getting the governments and private sector together to focus on binding constraints. That was driven largely by the World Bank Group in the early mid 2000s. It has deviated somewhat. So from becoming quite mainstreamed, it's actually deviated from the idea that public-private dialogue was driven by results as a consequence of very intensive work with the private sector and the government to really focusing more on the dialogue. And I think that even though there was a recognition of the mainstreaming of the concept of public-private dialogue, it has become somewhat diluted in recent years to focus more on dialogue.
There is another term which is PPP, which is public-private partnership.
Yeah.
Is PPP and PPD similar or sequential, or they're
No,
nothing to do with one another?
it's a common issue, and was one reason why I came up with my new concept, public-private dialogue for results.
Yep.
It's often confused, and going into an emerging market and discussing the issue of PPD with a government, for example, they will often confuse it with PPP. So there's no real correlation. Yeah.
Great, and your response gives me an opportunity for a segue to my next question. What led to the development of your concept, public-private dialogue for results, and how does it differ from the traditional PPD approaches?
In working on PPD, which is very important, it's a critical part of any of a country's opportunity to develop its economy, is bringing the private sector into that discussion. So it's very important. And I believe that it's in a way, economic development's often the missing pillar in emerging markets, and the private sector is the missing component of that missing pillar. What I've seen is as public-private dialogue emerged in the mid 2000s, mainly directed by the World Bank Group. I was a part of that. We delivered a public-private dialogue handbook, gave many global conferences on it. Since the departure of that really intensive focus on public-private dialogue, as it's been picked up by other development partners, the focus has tended, as I said before, to focus more on the dialogue. And now, what that has meant is that when one meets with a government in an emerging market, they will often say now, oh, we are doing public-private dialogue because we're meeting with the private sector. Development partner assistance has tended to focus more on getting a result from the dialogue that has depended a lot on very specific resources allocated to getting very specific results. This is unsustainable. And I've noticed that the dilution of the concept is actually leading more harm than good in emerging markets, because the private sector is again being left out of the equation. The idea of public-private dialogue for results was to bring back an acknowledgement that to move forward, to have a sustainable impact, that you needed to look at both institutional strengthening as well as getting results for dialogue.
Well said. But the other aspect, James, is that when you talk results, there is also a question of accountability. So
Right.
where does accountability lie when it comes to PPD or PPDR?
Accountability is critical. So political will is very important for getting results from dialogue. And a key component of that is making sure that when a dialogue happens based on the good works of advocacy, the good works of inputs from both government and private sector participants, that there's follow-up for it, that there's visibility for the commitments made, and that there's a process whereby all the stakeholders who are committed to a dialogue are able to see the results for their work. That includes, usually, I can say this in a very general sense, the private sector will attend meetings and often leave frustrated because they know that whatever commitment was given, they have no means of that being implemented. They have no means of following it up. So introducing an accountability mechanism that is transparent, that is honest to the dialogue, is very important for getting results in PPDR.
Thank you. My next question is, in your view, what are some of the critical institutional constraints in public and private sector engagement?
Well, they're varied. Governments often have siloed constraints. They often don't communicate between one ministry to another. So they vary. They often very honestly appreciate the PPDR work simply because it provides them with information that they don't have. So in very good cases where you have interministerial working groups, the government both have to sit together, and then when you introduce, when a good accountability mechanism is used, a good tool, a matrix tool, for example, governments are fascinated often to find out what each other's doing. From the private sector side, it's not under PPDR. We look at sort of at identifying different status levels for a PPD in specific countries. So you have nascent PPDs where there are none, but typically in conflict countries. you have emerging, you have mature and institutionalized. So we look at each country through the lens of its status in terms of PPDR, and then look at what specific constraints there are to institutions in those countries. In a nascent market, it'll be building the institutions themselves from scratch. And Southern Sudan, after the civil war there back in 2005 or so, that was the case. But in mid-market economies such as countries like Albania, that's not the case. There's very high capacity, and you provide. They have different types of institutional constraints relating to creating platforms for dialogue, for example.
Well said. And what metrics would you use to measure the success of a PPDR initiative?
Yeah, again, it goes back to those different status levels. So the issue is not to apply the same. There's just not one magic potion for all. You have to sort of cater your methodology depending on the status of the dialogue itself. So again, in a nascent PPDR, we would look at issues of trust, of a capacity to organize meetings, of advocacy. Is there an advocacy function within the business membership organizations? Within government, do they have the ability to coordinate internally? So they're very, in nascent PPDRs where there's the risks are very high in terms of stakeholders being able to meet or not, your metrics that should meet the situation that you're working within. But in other, middle income countries or higher, the metrics are going to be very much around what sort of results are you getting? Are you getting the cost, a good cost benefit ratio for the amount of effort you're putting in? What's not the quantity of meetings, but the quality of them? So there are different metrics depending on the different status.
Very interesting. A few minutes back, you just mentioned Somalia, and you're working currently in say Cambodia.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm assuming that a lot of the work happens in the developing countries.
Yeah.
But you've also spoken a little bit about government commitment. My question to you, James, is what are some of the biggest challenges that are being faced by PPD and PPDR?
From a government perspective or overall?
I know as schemes.
Yeah. Well, the biggest challenge, I think, is that the approach to PPDR is too often at a meso level within governments and within development partners, but not with the private sector. So when we work in emerging markets, it's often talked to the very senior levels of a business membership organization, a chamber of commerce, federation, a sector association, who are very willing to engage. Development partners who are funding this kind of work, who are supportive of it, tend to look at it as meso level work. They don't give it the priority that it deserves. This is strategic work. This is an issue of a government's making a decision on economic policy by integrating the private sector into their very high level process. In Cambodia, the Government Private Sector Forum, the plenary session is a cabinet level meeting with the Prime Minister in attendance. Decisions are cabinet level decisions. So I think in my experience in most emerging markets, what I'm finding is I'm dealing with people within the private sector at a high level, the government, at a ministerial level, but the development partners are looking at this from a program level. So they're not looking at it from a strategic perspective. So I think the big challenge in emerging markets is elevating the concept of PPDR to a much higher level in terms of a strategic narrative on economic growth.
Fascinating. And what role, in your view, do the bilateral and multilateral development organizations play in economic development today?
They play a very important role, provided they take it. So, they provide the analytical work, the program work. I'm a beneficiary of that, obviously, and I've worked for all them, most of the major multilateral and bilateral partners over the last 24 years. They provide a very important role. However, they're most effective, I think, when they're coordinated and also when the government is in a position where it's demanding accountability and also focusing them in the direction that they think they need to go, rather than the other way around.
And would you say these projects that you talk about, are these infrastructure projects, health projects, or any other kind of projects?
Across the board. So public-private dialogue for results is economy-wide. It can be sector-specific. It can be in clusters. It's really, in Cambodia, there are 15 working groups covering 15 different sectors. That's a heavy load. But in some countries, in Jordan, there was a Jordan Valley Water Forum, for example, looking at water specifically. So you can look at tax specifically, trade. It's the application of it is very broad. But at a strategic level, for example, in Ethiopia, it was the largest public-private dialogue in Africa, and it covered everything from national all the way down to Warada and village level issues. So it can be a very broad or very specific.
Incredible. And you said water is also something which is part of one of the PPDs somewhere in the world.
Sure. Ethiopia, Bangladesh, many countries look at very specific issues relating to, whether it's a clothing sector issue, they're looking at water, agriculture, water. So it cuts across all sorts of all sectors and all thematic areas.
And from the time you initiate a project till the time the project comes to a close, how long could the duration be?
Well, in Ethiopia, I was with the International Finance Corporation. It took us 6 years to develop the Ethiopia Public-Private Consultative Forum. That was the longest project they'd ever had the patience to implement, but it was very successful once it was up and running. And so that's a long gestation period. In Nepal, for the Nepal Business Forum, once we started that straight after the end of the civil war there, it was the Nepal Business Forum was as I understand, was the first economic policy decision made by the Nepalese government after that conflict, and that happened really quite quickly. I think within a year or so we had that up and running. But in terms of sustainability, my argument is actually that PPD, when I talk about a nascent PPD, a PPDR, what I really mean is that it doesn't matter what economy you're in, what sort of level the economy is at, whether it's in a conflict or whether it's fully emerged or fully developed, or debatable kind of concept, but that an economy has a PPD. So it continues. It's just a matter of where you come into it to provide support, but that it's always there, and that we're always working to improve its status from one level to the next.
Amazing.
So,
Amazing. Thank you. And now if you were to, based on all the years that you've worked in the area of economic development, and given the fact that a lot of countries are now wanting to do things which will enhance the lives of a lot of their people in their respective countries, where do you see the future of economic development heading in the next decade?
Oh, it's very positive. I think economic development, I would like to see economic development much more a central pillar of working in emerging markets. But regardless of that, over the years, I've seen the emergence of the private sector is taking a lot of the space where traditional development partners were. And I think that's the right thing. I think a lot of bringing in a lot of that capacity for global capacity directly from the private sector to emerging markets is really critical. So I think the trajectory over time will be that increasingly economic development is taken on by the people who should be, sort of driving it, which is much more private sector interest. And I think that's a very positive sign for emerging markets.
And another question, just a clarifying question for you, James. Once a PPD project comes to an end, the government takes it over, or the private sector takes it over, or whatever is written in the agreement?
Well, under PPDR, I mean, that's really the genesis of PPDR, the idea that sustainability comes from within. And so where they fail mostly is that if a development partner has come in and provided very specific resources to a PPD, then the chances are it'll fail, unless They may get very good results whilst they're there, but when they leave, it'll fail. And the reason for that is they're focused too much on the dialogue and not enough on the institution. So it should always be taken over. The process should be so well understood by government and private sector that it's at that point of what I call institutionalization, so that they're ready to take it on and move it forward. But over time, other development partners or other private sector participants can come in and provide very specific support to make it move forward. But real sustainability comes from within government and private sector.
So I have time for two more questions. My next one is that can you share an example where PPDR has successfully driven sustainable outcomes?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy. I think to say Cambodia, where I am now and where I started this, and it's actually been a remarkable experience for me professionally to return here last year and look at a PPDR that I had a lot of involvement in for 6 years, 2002, 2007. The World Bank carried it on for IFC carried it on for an extra 2 years. So and then there was no support for it from the time we left until the time I returned, and yet it continued, and it's had a very dynamic involvement here. Back in that time, the World Bank and the Australian government undertook a study that an assessment of the work that we had done at that time, and found that it had contributed to a range of indicators, including contributing to peace and stability after the period of conflict, but also over $350 million returned to the private sector, over thousands of issues raised. Since we left, they had no involvement from any other development partner, and so to come back and see that it had that it was contributing still to taxation reform, to customs, to education, to health, and that it had been sustainable by itself, albeit with as I say, it's at a different status level and needs a different kind of support.
Fascinating. And my last question to you, James, and this is for you personally. Can you share a lesson that you have learned from all the work that you have done in so many different countries that has profoundly impacted your own approach to economic development?
Well, I think the most important thing in PPDR is to both listen directly to your stakeholders. We're dealing with very bright people, very passionate about their countries. They have an opportunity to support their country's future. PPDR provides that avenue for people to have a direct interaction with their government representatives, the government representatives with their private sector. These are people that have a deep interest in the future of the country. To listen to the stakeholders is really critical. They will tell you more about the ins and outs of getting something done in the country than you can bring to the table. But also the other side of it, with the sort of expertise and experience, it is also to bring the stakeholders along as well. Don't get too far ahead. Don't think you've got the template for it and that it's going to work because you've got the experience, but to move along with the stakeholders.
Wow, thank you. Well, on that note, James, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for speaking to me about public-private dialogue, about public-private dialogue for results, and so many different aspects of PPD and PPDR. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you for spending time with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.